Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is writer Paul Kupperberg. Paul, welcome to Comic Culture.
Hi, Terrence. Thanks for having me.
Now, Paul, your career goes back many years, and your work is best known for a time that you were at DC. But right now, you are the executive editor at Charlton Neo Comics, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, because I'm familiar with Charlton Comics, the imprint, but this seems to be a resurgence of sorts.
Well, more like a hijacking, but yeah. Charlton Neo Comics, Charlton Comics started publishing in the mid-'40s. It was a little, one of the third-rung company out of Derby, Connecticut. It was a unique company. Most comic book companies were editorial and business offices. Charlton had not only that, but it also had the printing press and the trucking and distribution all in the same building, along with a bowling alley and a banquet hall. But those. But anyway, so Charlton was kind of this cheap, chintzy company. It was started by two guys who met in prison in the late 1930s. One of them, John Santangelo, was in there for copyright. What do you call it?
Infringement?
Anyway, infringement. Thank you. Big words sometimes slip my mind. And the other one, the other partner, was in there for some political corruption scandal. And they met and they became friends. And the corrupt politician said, "You can still publish what you were publishing." It was music lyrics that he was infringing the copyright on. And he said, "You can still publish those, just pay for the copyright. Just get the approval." So when they got out of prison, they started Charlton Publishing. However they did it, they acquired this printing press and this factory and this whole thing. And by the mid-'40s, they were doing fairly well, but they needed to keep their presses rolling, so they started publishing comic books on top of the magazines and everything. The comics were published through 1985. They published comic books, 40 years. They were, again, a third-rate company. They paid next to nothing. I mean, when I started in 1975 and I sold my first script to them, they were paying $5 a page to the writer. By contrast, a few months later when I started at DC, it was $15 a page. But somehow they managed to attract a lot of great talent. A lot of people started there. A lot of people like Steve Ditko worked there even for these crummy rates because they were given this total editorial freedom. They didn't care what was between the covers as long as it was clean and as long as it filled the pages and kept the presses rolling and the trucks going. This whole story, by the way, will be told. There's a documentary in the works, Charlton the Movie, all about the company, and the producers have been interviewing people who have worked there. We got Roy Thomas and Joe Sinnott and John Byrne and Mike Zeck and a whole bunch of people, and myself. Anyway, the full story is told there. But a few years ago, I joined a Charlton fan Facebook page run by a gentleman named Fester Faceplant. I believe that's a pseudonym. That or the Faceplants of Philadelphia. You know of them. They were in the steel business, I think. Anyway, other people started, other fans and professionals who would, fans of Charlton who had worked at Charlton started joining the page, and somebody made a joke about starting a fanzine with all the people on the page, and I volunteered to write a story if that happened, and it snowballed from there, and eventually myself and Mort Todd and Roger McKenzie kind of became the core editorial and creative force behind it. But we decided to, nobody was using the title. The company had been out of business since the early 90s. I checked. I live about 25 minutes away from Derby, Connecticut in Fairfield. So I drove to the site and I checked. The building's not even there anymore. We just started Charlton Neo Comics, and we did 6 issues via print on demand and mail order. And this month we published our first issue that was distributed through Diamond, and along with AC Comics, and this was our first issue, which sold out in about 2 days in the comic shops. And our second issue has been solicited and did very well. Good numbers even compared to number one. And the third issue just went on. I think the catalog just came out in the last day or two, so that's available. Go to your local comic shops, demand that they order it, and if they don't, stand in the middle of the shop and yell, "I want it! I want it! I want it!" Thank you. Go ahead.
I was going to say, now I know that a lot of the Charlton characters were sold to DC in the 1980s because Dick Giordano, who was one of the editors at Charlton, was at that point I guess your equivalent at DC in the 1980s. So the characters that you're publishing, were these characters that they didn't make the purchase on, or did you have to come up with some sort of agreement with DC?
We're not using those characters. There are a few. It's very confusing. We know definitely what happened to the ones that were sold to DC Comics, Captain Atom, The Question. Those guys are all well established. Peacemaker, and
Blue Beetle.
Blue Beetle, right? All those guys. DC uses them on a fairly regular basis. Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, that was returned to its creator, Pete Morisi. So he has his estate, his family has the rights to the character. And it's appeared in other publishers have done a series with that. Dynamite did a Thunderbolt series. And then there was a guy in Canada who apparently acquired the rights to a whole bunch of different characters, but we're not sure exactly which, and he hasn't really done much with them. And nobody's heard anything from him in years, so we're not quite sure. But for the most part, we just picked up a few kind of little bits and pieces, some characters that were floating around. Spookman was an obscure character that appeared in one story in the 60s, written and drawn by the great Pat Boyette. Roger McKenzie resurrected him. There's the Yellow Jacket is another, or the Yellow Bee, I forget exactly which, is another character who was a superhero who went around, who could control bees. He also went around with a bee in his belt buckle, and if he was in trouble, he'd let the bee out, and the bee would sting the bad guy, and while the bad guy was distracted, he would do what he did. So we've got the cream of the crop. But even the goofiest character, you can always find a way to make something out of them. But otherwise, we're going ahead and we're creating our own stuff. We're all having, we have, E-Man, of course. We're lucky enough to have Joe Staton and Nick Cuddy back, the original creators of E-Man from 1973, I think it was. And they're back, and they're doing. They did a brand new 3-part story for the new Charlton Arrow. But otherwise, we're coming up with new stuff. I mean, we don't have The Question, so I created our own version of The Question called Blank, and he's a different take on the faceless superhero. Talented artist named Todd Mulrooney is working on the first story, which should appear in number 3. So things like that. We just make them up and go with it.
And it seems like because of this connection to that classic publisher and that Facebook group that you were speaking about, it seems like you're able to get some talent, because you were saying Joe Staton, as I recall, he's working on the Dick Tracy syndicated newspaper strip. So for him to find the time to work on a comic must mean that he loves the process and the character and the people he's working with.
He does. Joe's, again, Joe retains the rights to E-Man. He got the rights to the character back, and he does love it, and he's always looking for an opportunity to get him back out there. But yeah, part of it is the lore of the Charlton thing. There was just something about that sleazy little third-rate company. It was just there was a lot of great goofy stuff in it. I took. They had these all these different horror books, and they had the horror hosts. So I took all the horror hosts and turned it into a group of cosplaying, detectives, comic book cosplaying. So I think I came up with the first cosplay group in comics, but called the Scary Squad, and it's coming in the first issue of Charltoons very soon. The whole thing's going to sound like a big plug because we got so many different things in the works. Every time I mention something, it's kind of like coming soon to a comic book near you. So yeah, we're just, letting people have their head. The invitation is if you've got something cool you want to do it. It's your creation. You come up with it, you control it. We'll either publish it if we like it, or won't publish it if we don't. Otherwise, it's hands off. So, we're just looking for good comic books. We're all of us of a different generation of fan, and Roger and Mort and myself, and we have an appreciation for the kind of older style of comic book storytelling. Not that we tell old-fashioned stories. We tell new stories, but in a kind of more accessible way. We most of our books are anthologies. We love the 6 and 8 and 10-page story. You can do a lot in that. It's a great punchy way to tell a wonderful little story. But if need be, we have the space to tell full-length stories as well. But we're not looking to do, create a whole new universe, and we're not looking to do crossovers. I said this on Facebook today. We're not looking to compete with Marvel and DC. We'd rather do good comic books.
Now, it's interesting because you are a creative person. You are a writer, you are an editor, but there's a business side to comics. And I'm just wondering, as you and your partners are working on these books, why make a print version of this when you can do it digitally, or you can release it on your own website as maybe a subscription service or something like that? And are you getting that involved in the business side of it from your office?
I'm involved in the business, although most of that gets taken care of by Mort Todd, who is more experienced in publishing. He's been publishing his own line of Ace Comics for several years, so he's been doing this for a while. He also does all of our production and coloring and lettering as well. So he's a busy man. But you have to be aware of the business end of things these days. It's just it's. When I started in comics, you either were published by Marvel or DC or Gold Key or Charlton or Warren or, one of the other two, Archie, but that was your option. There were a few outriders. There was Wally Wood doing Wit's End. There was Steve Ditko doing his Mr. A kind of character stuff. But mostly it was you go with the majors or you didn't go. Now there are so many options, and there's so many, the majors are limited. Marvel or DC, they don't want anything to do with Roger or myself anymore. Sure, we've been doing this for 40 years, and we're probably kind of know what we're doing by now. But that doesn't matter because we're old guys, and they can't. This is a young man's business. The whole Hollywood ethic, that the ageism in Hollywood has just thoroughly infected comic books. So there's no more room at the inn for old farts like us. So we're forced to go our own way. Chuck Dixon, another comic book writer, was he spoke up about the ageism a while back, and he took a lot of heat for it, but it's totally true. Other than a handful of professionals, from my generation or a little before me, still get new work, and those are kind of mercy flings and special projects kind of things. But so if there's nothing to do there, you make up your own, and fortunately we live in a time where the technology allows us to be. To look when the package arrives with a new issue of something we've published, I open it up and I look at it and I go, wow, this looks just like a real comic book. Yeah, and it is a real comic book. So we've got the opportunity. I've still got ideas. I've still got creative urges that I want to take care of. And so if they won't play, then we'll build our own playground.
Now, you've made a career as a writer, and I'm just wondering, when you are working on a script, it's a little different than when you're working as an editor, when you have to communicate with other writers and artists and kind of point them maybe in the direction that you think the book should go in, or maybe just sort of get them to see a solution that maybe they don't see right away. So I'm wondering how you balance the editorial side of it with the writer inside you.
I think at this point, it's experience. I do recognize that there are, I know my weaknesses. I'm very well acquainted with my weaknesses. I've had, 62 years to marinate in them. And when I reach those points, there are people I talk to. I mean, I don't just, fumble around. I talk to my peers, I know a lot of people who do this for a living as well. So, we do that. You'll run into a problem and you'll call a friend and say, I've hit this wall. What do you do? Or I'm thinking of trying it this way. What do you think? But really, I can. I hate to sound Trumpian, but I'm my own best advisor. I know what I want the story to be. I'm also used to working in the vacuum of pure prose. I write short stories and novels and nonfiction and things like that as well. So comics are a collaborative process, and you have other people. When you're writing prose, it's just you. Sure, there's an editor that you can rely on and you can call on, but it's really just like everything. A comic book script, you need to count on the artist being able to deliver what you're asking for. In prose, you got nobody to blame but yourself. So that's the way I think when I'm writing. I don't think in terms of comic book plot, because comic book plot on its base level is kind of lame and relies on coincidence and happenstance and characters doing what they need to do rather than what they would do, if left to act on their own devices as characters. So it's writing comic books is easy. Writing, because really you've got a lot of ways out. The form itself gives you a lot of the superhero genre gives you just all these easy outs. It's this thing we've never encountered before is coming to stomp on the city. What will we do? Well, I'll just pull this device out of my butt, and this will, I call it the. Now I'm blanking on what I call it, but I do call it that. It was the bit that Reed Richards used on.
Oh, the ultimate nullifier.
I call it the ultimate nullifier effect. Stan and Jack had written themselves into a corner. They didn't know how to defeat Galactus. So they pulled the ultimate nullifier out of their butts. And, it's like, better go away or we'll use this. What's that? But that's what comic book storytelling is. If you watch the TV shows, you get the same thing. It's like, no matter what it is, Cisco's going to build a thingamabob, and it's going to take care of the problem. So, you've got every easy out in the world when you're writing a comic book story. Now, if you want to write a really good comic book story and you don't want to rely on that stuff, you've got to, you got to kind of think more like a novelist than a comic book writer, because and you've got to think of your characters as real people, and not as these superpowered devices. I just go with my instinct, and hopefully if I've created a good enough character, he or she will take me where I need to go.
Now, I wanted to go back to a book that you did in the 1980s, early 1990s for DC called Checkmate. which was this, I guess this was sort of a government response to the world of superheroes, and you were on this for about 3 years. And I'm wondering, when you were working on this book, how you were able to sustain the ideas for 3 years and use the characters to help you, I guess, keep the story fresh for yourself, for the readers, and for the artists.
Well, Checkmate was a super secret spy organization built on the chessboard. So it was run by the queen and kings, and there were the bishops, and then you had the knights in the field, and they were the guys who got the cool costumes. It was largely a political strip. The book was a political comic book. It was all about terrorists and this and that and spies and all kinds of very little superhero stuff. Although we did bring in Peacemaker every now and then just to kind of blow things up. Not that I couldn't have blown them up all by myself. So it was easy, really. I mean, you just kind of read the newspapers, pay attention to what was going on in the world, look at the business, look at the business world. That's the kind of book that you can sustain for. I mean, geez, how much fun would it be to write something like that today? Looking with the cyber terrorism and Russia and what's going on in Washington. I would be having so much fun.
So we've just come up with a new series. I'd like a co-creator credit.
If we can get Checkmate back, and it's set today, and yeah, you got it.
So it is interesting because this is more sophisticated of an approach to writing comics, and I think we start to see in the 1980s fandom gets taken a little bit more seriously, and I guess to the point where we are today, where you can't go to the cinema without seeing, the big blockbuster superhero movie. So I guess with hindsight being 2020, did you have any sense that when you were working on that type of book that you were kind of changing perceptions of the audience?
I don't know if changing perception so much. I knew we were doing better comic books because we were dealing with realer stuff and not afraid to take chances. I didn't invent the grim and gritty, of course. That was really we can lay that at Frank Miller's feet. And what he did was perfectly valid, and but it doesn't work for the entire industry. Although that's what we've got. Everybody took it too far. But I was kind of in on the whole grim and gritty early on when I was doing the Peacemaker, miniseries was kind of a sick, psychotic little 4 issues. It was about a guy who was responding to the voice of his dead Nazi father in his head. Going out and blowing stuff up and to fulfill his missions. And it was pretty brutal. And, we were also doing that stuff. I was writing Vigilante, which is the comic that Checkmate grew out of after Vigilante was canceled. And that was about a total psycho. I mean, he started out as the superhero-ish, judge who puts on the costume to right the wrongs he couldn't right in the courtroom. But it evolved. Marv Wolfman created the character and wrote the first 15 issues. And after some fill-ins, I took over with around number 19 or 20. And it became a very different comic book. It wasn't a superhero comic. It was a psychodrama. And it was about a guy who was descending into madness. And eventually, over the course of my 30 issues or so, wound up going so insane that in the last issue he commits suicide. So I was playing in that grim and gritty stuff then, and there's a place for it. But I don't think Superman and Batman are the places. Not all the time, at least. But what do I know? I like that. I walk around saying we won. After all these years, after all, what was it, 1993 or 4, when Mouse came out, that, the New York Times began to take comic books seriously. And now, finally, 20 years later, we own the media, you know. How many superhero TV shows are on the air these days? 20, 25 every week, or, with Netflix involved. There's half the movies are either directly from comic books or influenced by comic books. At the moment we own it, but all the darkness, those aren't my superheroes. I'm a Kurt Swan Superman guy. My Superman smiled. Christopher Reeve flying around the earth at the end of Superman 1 and smiling at the camera and giving a wave. That's Superman. This guy without a smile on his face, without a hope for the world, that doesn't work for me. I understand the need for change, and I don't go crazy over the whole costume change thing and the personality and character change stuff. It's like, hey, you go with what sells. And the movies are not made for comic fans. If every comic fan who complained about these movies didn't go and see these movies, the producers wouldn't notice it in the bottom line. However many millions of people who go see these movies, you've got 100,000 comic book fans in the world. That's it. And the dirty secret is they're going to go and see it anyway, because what gives them more pleasure? What gives them more nachas than to sit and complain and bitch and moan about how horrible and how badly the producers screwed up these movies?
Now,
so,
Paul, I was going to say we have about 30 seconds left before we have to wrap up our show. I was wondering if people are interested in finding out more about Charlton Neo Comics, how can they find you on the web?
Well, they can find me on Facebook, and they can also find Charlton Neo Comics on Facebook, and they can Google CharltonNeoComics.com, Charlton Neo Comics, and ask for us by name.
Well, Paul Kupperberg, thank you so much for talking with me today. Thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon.